Uh, Dr. Zenz, it's our pleasure to be with you today. Dr. Adrian Zenz is a senior fellow and director in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, D.C. His early academic work initially focused on Tibet, but with the advent in the summer of 2017 of international reporting on large-scale internment and re-education facilities targeting ethnic minorities in the western region of Xinjiang in China, he has since pivoted towards the study of the government crackdown in that region and has emerged as one of the international community's leading voices on the humanitarian situation in that region. On behalf of the staff of the China Journal of Democracy, I'd like to express our gratitude for agreeing to share your time with us today to help us better understand what is going on in Xinjiang. Now, the Chinese government has strongly insisted that these are vocational and educational training facilities aimed at combating extremism among the region's various Muslim minority groups, whereas foreign observers and researchers counter that it is instead a intense crackdown on ethnic minority cultural and religious identity, as well as on fundamental human rights. Dr. Zenz, can you briefly summarize for us what has been going on in Xinjiang for these past 7 years with the advent of these camps? What exactly are these camps, and what are the objectives driving the government's policies in Xinjiang?
The so-called vocational skills education and training centers are re-education facilities that are refining and continuing a highly intrusive and brutal approach to brainwashing and political indoctrination that was developed by the Chinese Communist Party against the Falun Gong in the early 2000s. The campaign in Xinjiang was developed through a process of policy experimentation, which is a common way in which policy is developed through trial and error on the ground, first established under Mao Zedong, in order to test different approaches. And this process started essentially in 2013, when the state determined the need to quote-unquote de-extremify Uyghurs and other groups who were considered or proclaimed to have been infected with religious extremism. This pivot towards de-extremification as the main focus of Beijing's work in the region was confirmed and affirmed by Xi Jinping in speeches in the context of the second Central Xinjiang Work Forum in 2014. And the state started to set up the first dedicated full-time securitized re-education, or rather de-extremification facilities in late 2014 and through 15. And then in early 2017, after having brought on board Chen Quanguo, formerly party secretary in Tibet, to implement a campaign of mass internment, the campaign really took off in early 2017 and likely concluded sometime at the end of 2019 or early 2020.
Okay, now when you say that the internment campaign likely concluded around 2019, this means that the rounds of detention have concluded, but what has been continuing? Has the indoctrination continued?
The indoctrination has continued. The state created a temporary campaign of mass internment to sort the population. The camps had a function of indoctrination, but also of filtration to filter the Uyghur population. And we see a trend whereby a lot of the more educated Uyghurs, or those considered potentially more a threat to the state, were then sentenced to long prison terms. And we note that the region has greatly expanded its capacity of prisons and high security detention facilities. And a lot of the lesser educated or poorer, less important Uyghurs were shifted into forms of forced labor. We should also note that waves of arbitrary detention have continued since 2020, interning additional ethnic groups. However, these are not taking place under the very specific vocational skills education and training center policy framework.
Okay. Now, if I could focus on the one concept you introduced of the filtration of the Uyghur population into these various institutionalized contexts. You mentioned in one, the prison facilities, in the second instance, the forms of Uyghur forced labor. Now, are there any broader goals behind the forced labor campaign, say in terms of trying to socially re-engineer these interned Uyghurs, or is it just brutal forced prison labor?
So we need to distinguish between forced labor that was created by releasing re-education detainees into securitized coerced work placements, primarily as a form of coercive social integration, meaning to not just let them go free after re-education, but to engineer a process by which they were forced to sort of integrate themselves into a Chinese-dominated society by working in Chinese factories. And some, after a couple of months, were subsequently able to go back to earlier work or original workplaces. Others continue in forms of forced labor. This, in my opinion, was not so much, I think, not very primarily designed to create forced labor, but to engineer a coercive and secure process of release and forced integration of Uyghurs into Han-dominated society. However, the second and larger system of forced labor, not linked to the camps, the poverty elevation through labor transfer system, which became quite intensified concurrent with the campaign of mass internment in 2017. Of course, it's existed since the early 2000s and was not always purely coercive, became highly coercive under Chen Quanguo, has been expanded under Ma Xingray, the current party secretary, and continues unabated. This system of forced labor through poverty elevation takes rural farmers, ethnic farmers, peasants from the countryside, and forces them to enter full-time, mostly factory work. And so we should understand the campaign of mass internment as kind of a core, creating a state of exception, but surrounded by other policies that were implemented concurrently and all of which continue. And this whole package is the coercive social re-engineering that the Chinese state is implementing in the region. So we have profound changes in Uyghur society being enforced through forced poverty elevation and labor transfers. We have the separation of parents and children through boarding schools, full-time boarding facilities, preschool, full-time boarding preschool facilities from an early age. We have population control and management, including through birth prevention. We have the continued suppression of religion, etc. And so these policies operate in tandem to affect long-term change, besides the campaign of mass internment. But the campaign of mass internment, I think, the VZ policy, VZ meaning vocational skills education and training centers, kind of forming a bit of the heart, like the most extreme, most vivid measure to crush resistance, detain almost like at least one person from every household, according to the words of Zhao Keji, formerly Minister of Public Security, and then filter that population and create that government intrusion surrounded by these other policies. So it's kind of a comprehensive measure, if that's understandable.
And now, when you talk about the internment campaign having led to this state of exception, and now as it evolved in tandem with these other social reengineering projects in Xinjiang, has this state of exception, in terms of, say, the policing methods that the Chinese state used to detect, quote unquote, extremism or identify individuals for detainment, Is this police state still in effect, this police state of surveillance, these technologies of policing? Are these sort of become the new normal in Xinjiang?
That's a very good question. So indeed, the intrusive surveillance and the high-tech police state with its capacity to survey and detain persons at very short notice was set up and established right before the campaign of mass internment. It was very visible and designed to visibly intimidate during the campaign. But then, as Chen Quanguo himself, in an internal speech transcript from 2018, told officials, he already then predicted or said the plan was to background the police state, to make it largely invisible without reducing its capabilities. So what we're seeing is a backgrounded surveillance and police state that has maintained the same level of capabilities and manpower to survey and control Uyghur and ethnic societies, but to be much less visible in order to present the facade of like a new Xinjiang, make it look nice and attractive, especially to Han tourists, pretend that everything is fine, thereby creating kind of a new normal that has an appearance of normality, but beyond the surface, you have an extensive police state, you have millions of traumatized Uyghurs, traumatized in different ways through internment, sterilizations, police terror, etc., beneath the surface.
Now, you mentioned you alluded to the potential implications of these policies when you talk about millions of Uyghur citizens traumatized by these experiences, when you talk about the government trying to sell this new normal for Han public consumption. I want to ask, do you anticipate any, so to speak, form of blowback within Xinjiang society as a result of these policies? Increased tensions within Xinjiang between Uyghur and Han?
For us from the outside, this is very difficult to assess independently and objectively. We know that ethnic unity has come to be enforced even more drastically than before. We know that the Uyghurs have been taught that any resistance to the state results in severe punishments. Intimidation has been massive, has been dramatic. And under these conditions, we can only imagine how Uyghurs are surviving, pretending to go along with the policies, but then on the inside being torn apart, being traumatized, being affected, since many people had at least one person in the household detained in some form. Or still, I mean, at least hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs are still missing, continue to be missing, being detained in more high security facilities or formal prisons. And under these circumstances, we know that the deep traumatization of Uyghur society continues. Uyghur resistance appears to have been crushed. How will this play out in the long term? Nobody knows.
Do you see any indications that the Chinese public at large within China, but outside of Xinjiang, is accepting this new normal? Or do you see any indications of potential disinclination or resistance toward these policies?
So the Chinese state has managed to communicate all of this in a form that has portrayed its measures as necessary and effective in order to counter terrorism and violent resistance. And therefore, the state has co-opted and convinced the majority of the Han population that its methods are justified and necessary. There appears to be quite strong support among Han society outside of Xinjiang and in Xinjiang. And with some Han voices being critical or concerned, but those would not be dominant. So in many ways, the Chinese state has secured the support of the Han majority which of course is not aware of some of the excesses, brutalities, or scale of the internments, but has just been told that some Uyghurs have been imprisoned while others simply were subjected to vocational skills training to help them lead a better life and not have a sort of not be seduced by terrorists because they're so poorly educated. So that is the situation, and that of course is the foundation for a Chinese state to continue in the long term to ignore foreign opinion, to ignore international criticism, because domestic support for its policies in Xinjiang has, broadly speaking, continued.
Can you give the audience some examples of what would get the average Uyghur interned in these various prison or re-education facilities? What is
Sorry,
the
could you repeat the question? Could you repeat that question?
Of course, sorry. Can you just give the audience some examples of what sort of behavior the Chinese government would consider extremist or warrant detainment or re-education or vocational training, so to speak?
Yes, certainly. The Chinese state in 2014 published a list of 75 signs of extremism, which included young people growing a beard, wearing sort of conservative or Islamic dress, women wearing veils, a resistance towards sending kids to public schools, which of course are highly secular, resistance towards local government policies, including like poverty alleviation policies, a negative attitude towards the state or the Han. And from internal files like the Karakash list, a list of detained persons and the reason for the detention that was leaked in 2020, showed that Uyghurs were detained for simply for little things as little as saying like a customary prayer at a funeral, even 10 years before detention, or having had an extra child more than the family planning allowance, or having listened to religious sermons even when they were children, or some of these cultural expressions of Islam, entirely harmless, even taking place 25 years ago, being retrospectively punished and detained for that purpose.
Now, this ostensibly, according to the government's own rhetoric, this is a program to combat terrorism and extremism, but one aspect that might be surprising to an international audience is something you've alluded to already several times, the population control and management. You just mentioned, for example, women being interned for so-called family planning or birth control violations. Why, in addition to this crackdown on religious and cultural practices, are so-called family planning violations also part of the crackdown? Why is this population control also part of this internment and re-education campaign?
So in my research, I've identified that there have been quite a few narratives and discourses of Chinese scholars who also have an official position or funded by the government, who expressed concern, and even one high-profile ex-PCC official, a leading official of the Xinjiang Construction and Production Corps, saying that concentrated Uyghur populations represent a danger to the state, a danger to Chinese national security, because concentrated Uyghur populations that are growing at a high pace are connected to the belief that this land belongs to them, that they might be independent, and so on. And therefore, the attempt to so-called optimize, quote unquote, optimize the ethnic population structure has the one component of taking Uyghurs out of their homeland, such as through labor transfer, forced labor arrangements, and then on the other hand, through massive birth prevention to reduce their growth. So high Uyghur population growth and high Uyghur population concentrations are seen as risks to Chinese national security. And obviously, a population that doesn't grow as fast or is smaller is easier to control, it's easier to survey. You know, they were struggling putting all these Uyghur kids in school or these boarding schools. I mean, that's a big job to have police control them. So that's another aspect.
Now, do these policies, Chinese government policies, contrived in response to what they see as the threat, as the national security threat of a growing ethnic minority population, do these policies constitute genocide?
In my opinion, and according to my research, I've identified both the fact of massively declining birth rates, which relates to one of the criteria of the 1948 United Nations Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, namely the suppression of births of a protected group. And I have established also the intent behind such an act, which is important for a determination of genocide. You need to determine intent. The intent is to reduce and to control the Uyghur population. And therefore, I think we see strong indications, certainly for a high risk of a genocide occurring and being in an ongoing state. And then it would be up to legal experts, but several legal experts, such as an independent tribunal, based on my research and assessments, have in the US government and 10 or 11 national parliaments have made determinations of genocide.
Could you speak more in detail about these international legal redress and advocacy efforts? Do you see them having any impact on the situation in Xinjiang?
I think the Chinese state has paid close attention to them. So we've had, of course, genocide determinations by the US government. We've had resolutions calling the situation in Xinjiang genocide by multiple parliaments of different countries, such as Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and so on. And we've had the Independent Uyghur Tribunal in London, which was chaired by expert prosecutor Sir Geoffrey Nice. And these legal efforts, especially if you look at the Uyghur Tribunal and also more recently the People's Tribunal in The Hague that was held in July, what we have is legal experts looking at the evidence and making determinations saying we see an intent to destroy in part or in whole a protected group through various measures, including, and I think most prominently, the prevention of births within the group. I, as a researcher, see a strong risk of genocide also because data is being withheld. Birth rate data is no longer published since I published my groundbreaking report on birth prevention in the middle of 2020. But I have to say that the most effective probably measures to maybe change something on the ground or to enact a cost from the Chinese Communist Party for its atrocities have been in relation to forced labor. In that the United States established the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the European Union passed legislation that will come into effect in 3 years, and many companies have been forced to divest from related supply chains, and that I think has had an economic impact linked to the atrocities, so that those perpetrating atrocity are less able to profit from it.
I'd like to ask about your use of hacked and leaked top secret Chinese government documents in your research. In particular, you mentioned the Uyghur Tribunal, and the reports that you published on their behalf included analysis of very important Chinese government documents. And would you be able to explain to us how you've been able to authenticate and corroborate this evidence? Is it possible that these materials are inauthentic or perhaps even generated by AI? And have there been any instances where you declined to report on certain hacked or leaked materials because you weren't able to authenticate it?
I have not ever come across a document that I felt was inauthentic and therefore declined to analyze it, or analyzed it and found it was inauthentic. I have on occasion received very isolated files that I felt were not worth the effort or were not significant enough in order to justify an entire report or of sufficient interest for a media outlet to report on it. We've had received files that had significant forensic markings, such as original stamps and signatures. We had contents that was entirely consistent with other policies and publicly available evidence, signed by leading officials who we knew were in the position that the signature showed they were in. And sometimes we had very interesting cross-corroboration. For example, one of the entire documents leaked in the so-called Xinjiang papers, a document pertaining to the official version of the history of Xinjiang. A full copy of the exact same paper was also contained in the Xinjiang police files, therefore 100% corroborating its authenticity with markings and signatures. The Xinjiang police files, the largest cache of files obtained by hacking into police computers directly, therefore not leaked. Its authenticity can be established by the fact that it contains thousands of images of persons taken in detention facilities and of police and of the detention facilities themselves, and many other images of police operations, of police drills, hundreds of PowerPoints of police training materials, tens of thousands of documents, image material evidently from the region, material in Uyghur language. I mean, to try to fake or use AI to create such a cache of documents. And of course, we corroborated, also cross-corroborated and triangulated many of the documents, I think would be impossible. Plus, you would need to have access to the region.
Now, you mentioned government documents also in the Uyghur language. This may be surprising to an international audience, but some of your work has also covered the use of Uyghur police in the policing, in the surveillance, and the internment campaigns. What is their role of Uyghur and other police officers from ethnic minority backgrounds?
Yes, so the documents in Uyghur were typically like court-related documents or instructions or notices intended for like local residents who may not speak Chinese. Important documents were all in Chinese. But my research has shown that the Chinese state recruited many thousands of Uyghur police officers in the months before the start of the campaign. Simply to have the manpower in those Uyghur regions. I mean, not all Han Chinese are willing to move to these regions, and Han police officers are also more expensive. Many of the Uyghurs were hired as auxiliary police, which receive a lower pay and can be let go anytime. So they were boosting their manpower, but of course they also wanted police who are able to speak to the people, to the locals, and understand what they say, so they can spy on them as well.
No, I'd like to ask you how you respond to Chinese government denials and denunciations. The Chinese government typically responds that foreign reportage on Xinjiang is propaganda, it's atrocity propaganda, it's propaganda antagonistic to China, aiming to destabilize or discredit it on the international stage. Are you concerned about the potential involvement of any ulterior agenda of foreign governments antagonistic to China that are exploiting the situation as a pretext for their own interests? And if so, have you experienced or felt any pressure from foreign governments or other organizations on your research to slant it a certain way?
I've seen the opposite problem. I've seen the problem of governments not caring at all or not sufficiently about this atrocity. I mean, if you consider how severe this atrocity is, I mean, representing the largest internment of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust, since the Nazi time. It's entirely justified that foreign governments would be highly concerned about this, express strong concerns, and enact significant countermeasures and sanctions to penalize the perpetrators. To not do so would be a violation of a basic sense of humanity or of I would not preclude that there are political groups, especially on the right, who might use situations for their political ends. But I think I have not seen that to be a dominant factor. Rather, I have seen right concerns about human rights violations, and primarily what I see is a severe lack of action. Especially, of course, especially disappointing have been the lack of response by Muslim countries, by in the global South, who seem to be have fallen prey to Beijing's elite capture through the Belt and Road Initiative and other diplomatic measures. Severe disappointment also I have over the lack of response from the United Nations, even the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, who wrote a report, but since then has done nothing about the situation, nothing sufficient. There have been closed-door conversations, but that doesn't move the needle. And also a relative lack of action by European countries, who ended up passing a legislation on forced labor, but a heavily diluted one.
And so what sort of action would you like to see from the United Nations or European countries? More legislative action in the realm of sanctioning forced labor?
China should be severely reprimanded and face diplomatic sanctions at the UN, especially in the Human Rights Council. China's rights and privileges at the United Nations should be partially suspended until it remedies the situation. China should face diplomatic and economic sanctions over its behavior, not just measures to combat the import of goods made with forced labor, but actual sanctions. There should be a greater use of Magnitsky sanctions against higher level officials responsible for overseeing what happened at the central government level in Beijing, not just sanction in Chen Quanguo. We have to say the European Union did not even sanction Chen Quanguo, the official in Xinjiang. Not even him. They just sanctioned lower level officials. And so we really need to see much stronger measures in that regard.
No, in terms of addressing how this crisis came to be, you mentioned, for example, going back to one of, in fact, I believe your first publication on this issue in 2017, you wrote that the, quote, re-education drive epitomizes the biopolitics of China's war on terror. Now, when you use the term war on terror, are you implying linkages with the West's own American-led war on terror, or is the Xinjiang campaign an outgrowth of more domestic roots, or is it a combination of these factors?
Are you sure that it was me who used the term biopolitics of the war of terror? That's an expression, like in what publication did I use this?
Oh,
Can you?
so this was co-authored with James Leibold?
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, okay.
So,
The co-author, the one on the policing.
correct.
Yes. Yeah, that's an expression that I really haven't used since then. And this is very much a position taken by the scholar Sean Roberts in his book War on the Uyghurs, arguing especially that the Chinese took on the framing of the war on terror that the US adopted after 9/11 in order to mask its assimilatory moves. And in some ways that's true. I mean, it's true. The Chinese did use strategically kind of jump on the bandwagon of the war on terror that the United States back then kind of kicked off. I have not focused so much on this. I think a lot of in a Xinjiang scholarship, a lot of scholars have been very interested to see how the US sort of enabled China to persecute the Uyghurs with that sort of under that cover. My focus has been more directly on the policies and the thoughts and also the paranoia of the Chinese Communist Party. In 2022, I used the term political paranoia, which comes from the scholarship of genocide and mass atrocities. Political paranoia to describe what I saw in the Xinjiang police files, a paranoid framing of Uyghurs as a human threat, as a national security risk. And I was using the term, try to explain why the Chinese state thought that, women, teenagers, elderly people, weak people had to be guarded by heavily armed police. Why they felt they needed machine guns on watchtowers, military-grade machine guns, as if somebody was going to try to attack the re-education camps. There was an incredible sense of paranoia emanating from the speeches of Chen Quanguo at the time, but also from other officials. And so I used the term political paranoia to explain some of these dynamics. And of course, as other scholars such as Steve Tsang have aptly described, Leninist party states tend to be very paranoid regimes that are constantly concerned about their own security.
And in addition to that Leninist political structure, what are the other sources of this political paranoia? Is this scale of paranoia proportionate to any threat of terrorism or instability in the region?
It's not at all proportionate towards a terror threat. It is maybe not proportionate, but it is somewhat understandable from a perspective of absolute regime security and control. Meaning, the Chinese state realized they could not control the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs did not want to be governed by the Chinese. They couldn't penetrate that society. They couldn't convince them and change them. And so from that perspective of paranoid regime security through a lack of total control of the population, yes, the Chinese state realized that that control wasn't possible. The Uyghurs were not going to be loyal to Beijing. But then, of course, that is not commensurable, I think. That could conceivably cause this kind of paranoia, but of course, this paranoia still represents a great exaggeration of a threat perception.
Now, if possible, I'd like to quote from another one of your earlier publications in 2018. You write, quote, "Just as Xinjiang has become China's testing ground for cutting-edge surveillance technology, the state may use the experiences gathered from re-educating this large Muslim minority group for its social re-engineering across this nation," end quote. Now, you wrote this in 2018. And at the beginning of this interview, also, you mentioned the origins of some of these Xinjiang crackdown policies in the political indoctrination techniques that the Chinese government had developed originally outside of Xinjiang in its imprisoning of Falun Gong members. Another detail is Chen Quanguo was also, before his post in Xinjiang, in Tibet. And so there's a pattern, it seems, of policies developed outside of Xinjiang being imported into Xinjiang. But going back to your quote, having written that in 2018, to what extent has that prediction been bearing fruit since? Have you been seeing this social reengineering techniques being rolled out across the rest of China?
We see the Chinese state adopting some of its approaches in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong now, in terms of political re-education in different forms, not mass internment, but in terms of national education, speaking about extremism amongst Hong Kong resistance and therefore the need to counter this extremism, framing it that way, and then enacting related political education in schools, but also indoctrinating detained Hong Kongers. And of course, the Hong Kongers saw this coming. They saw this coming, and that's part of why they put up so much resistance. We also can read of several cases where Hong Kong police went to Xinjiang to learn from the Xinjiang officials. We see, I think, concurrent developments, of course, during COVID, the COVID lockdown, and the use of grassroots management and local coercion to enact these incredible lockdowns and this kind of COVID-style police state controlling every movement and surveying it and contact tracing, extreme forms of contact tracing. And these are concurrent developments where I'm sure there was cross-fertilization, where Chinese security companies were able to refine their methods in Xinjiang. Xinjiang was like a laboratory where they could deploy intrusive techniques against the Uyghurs that they could not have deployed elsewhere. And there would have been a learning process that would have cross-fertilized developments in other parts of the country. But this, of course, is somewhat speculative. This is like a general observation. We don't have significant specific evidence to that, but I'm sure that's what happened.
Okay. Now, it might be further speculation, but do you see indications of, on the international level, any other foreign governments interested in this Xinjiang model of social control? Did you see any cross-fertilization with any other countries in the region?
We see the exporting of so-called smart cities, cities where a citywide system of control, management, surveillance, security, management, including like energy consumption, managing streetlights, and so on, with cameras, has been exported to Central Asia, such as Bishkek, been exported to Zimbabwe. I am sure that these regimes are very interested in what the Chinese have developed and learned. And of course, smart cities and surveillance experiments you find outside of Xinjiang in China. But in Xinjiang, they are deployed at an unprecedented level.
Now, in terms of your forecasting, short term and long term in the future, what do you think the likelihood is of any scenario where the Chinese government begins to either moderate or reverse its course in Xinjiang in these various policies, or is it sort of past the point of no return in developing into this new normalized, heavily securitized police state?
So in Xinjiang, I think, as in other parts of China, the Chinese state is, under Xi Jinping, is keen to have absolute control and to even shape people's thought preemptively. The goal is to be as preemptive as possible to predict problems before they happen. Also to preempt, to disenable resistance from being able to organize. And therefore, I think we see these very comprehensive high-tech measures, but also very much man-powered. A lot of human resources are necessary to, this is basically like a Maoist state. Or you could compare it onto Nazi Germany, where every house block had like a Gauleiter, or local Nazi officials, or not officials, but like deputized citizens, controlling house entrances. And of course, under Mao Zedong, everything was heavily locked down. You had incredible grassroots capacity. And that's what we see under Xi Jinping, the desire to really control everything at the local level, also with his targeted poverty elevation. Poverty elevation no longer sort of sitting at the top, being kind of voluntary, maybe trickling down at some point. No, officials going from door to door, knocking on doors, entering households, gathering data, and asking, why are you not taking this job? This kind of targeted population management, targeted governance, targeted poverty elevation, highly intrusive, highly controlling, having a digital file on every single person. That is the approach we see China taking under Xi Jinping. And of course, it's particularly intensive in Tibet. It's particularly intensive in Xinjiang and Tibetan regions in particular.
Are these policies liable to become even more intensive against the backdrop of rising American-Chinese tensions in the coming years?
I I think on the surface, the Chinese state pretends to be concerned about US-Chinese tensions. But I very much am of the opinion that Xi Jinping's primary concern is resistance within his own population. I don't think he sees, American influence in China is minuscule. Of course, the US is containing high-tech and chip imports. But that's another concern. That would not be connected to grassroots governance and securitization within China. The Chinese state is afraid of its own people, just like we saw with the East German Republic in communist Eastern Germany, which even built a wall preventing citizens from going to the West. And this kind of fear of its own population, I think, is what drives the Chinese state. And that's, I think, why we see this extension to the grassroots surveillance. But I'm not sure how you could even make this more extreme. I mean, the Chinese state has almost reached like a North Korean level of securitization of society. How could you even make this more extreme? I mean, you can. I'm sure you can go a little ways, but I think Xi Jinping has already reached a very high level of societal securitization.
Now, how durable is this state? You've mentioned other historical antecedents in Maoist China, in East Germany, in the Nazi state. These are other political projects in the past that collapsed. But is this a durable state? Do you see it surviving for long?
I think it is ultimately very fragile. Ultimately, as a state like this that is so intrusive and penetrating carries high risks of moving into excess and losing popular support, of stifling its own innovation. You know, the Chinese state has survived because of innovation and adaptability under Deng Xiaoping and the reform period. And Mao just kind of controlled the whole country through sheer revolutionary passion and a lack of any alternatives. China was totally isolated. There was no possibility of resistance. But in the current state, I think Xi Jinping is facing significant risk by combining such an atrophy and ossification, decreasing adaptability. This has led to reductions in innovation, in technological breakthroughs. It has led to a reduction in economic growth. The innovative drive of the citizenry. He is scared of Chinese entrepreneurs, high tech, like companies like Jack Ma. You know, highly successful entrepreneurs like Jack Ma are basically out of the picture now, and that is bad news. I think not just for the Chinese people, but it's also bad news for the long-term survival of the CCP. However, these risk factors do not automatically translate in regime change or collapse. It's just very unpredictable.
Now, I understand it's a very unpredictable situation, but if I could, as the final question to the interview, seeing as the theme of this journal is democratic transition and reform in China, do you see any sort of potential Chinese government after Xi Jinping or even after the CCP? What sort of challenges do you see this potential future Chinese government in transition facing in Xinjiang? That is to say, this human rights crisis in Xinjiang, does this stem just from Communist Party governance, or is it something much deeper in the nature of Chinese rule over Xinjiang?
So, of course, we have also a heavy dose of Han chauvinism and racism, of Chinese beliefs connecting back to imperial times, that China is sort of the epitome of civilization, has almost like a natural right to rule over lesser civilized peoples. And therefore, I think sort of any Chinese effort to democratize or to change has to be very, very humble and very self-critical in reflecting on its relation to ethnic groups, and of course, particularly the situation in Xinjiang. And I mean, if China ever became democratic, what would invariably happen is that they would find that there are significant Uyghur and Tibetan populations. Not all, especially some, especially among some Tibetans, it really depends where you kind of go. But there would be a strong desire for independence and to be just done with being ruled by Han Chinese. And I think if China ever became democratic, and democratic China would have to contend with not oppressing but releasing into freedom peoples who do not wish to be governed by Han Chinese.
Okay.
But that's a very far out there. I typically don't I don't I'm a researcher, so I don't typically do political I don't do political activism. I don't speak about, Uyghur or Tibetan independence. But in order to answer your question here about if China became democratic, that is a thought that comes to mind. And that is something that a future democratic Chinese government or transitional government would have to reflect on very seriously.
Well, thank you, Dr. Zenz, for indulging in my question, because I hope that it will be very helpful for readers of the journal who are interested in democratic transition, to help them engage with these deeper systemic roots of the crisis in Xinjiang. Again, we're very grateful for your time today, and thank you very much. It was a very enlightening, if not also very disturbing conversation, but it's a very important topic. So thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. And I thank the journal. And yeah, I'm very glad that we can engage on this topic. And I look forward to seeing it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.